everyone. I am Elton Furlaneto, and I would like to thank you for being here with us, watching Literary Talks, conversations about literature, which is a project that we take here at UFMS at the class called Literatura Contemporânea em Língua Inglesa. And we are every year we have some guests here that are related to the field of literature. They come here to be interviewed by the students and to answer some questions about their relationship with literature, especially contemporary literature. So today our big topic is translation, and we have here some guests that are translators. We have Shelly Boyle and we have Jana Bianchi. I would like to thank them so much for being here with us. And I'm not going to be taking so long here. I'm going to give the word to Gabriela, who is going to ask the first question, and you are going to get to know a little bit better these wonderful women that are translators, but they are also writers, they are also editors, they are so many things. I would spend here many minutes telling you about. So let's get to the questions. If you have questions too, please write them on the chat, and if we have time, we are going to include them here. And also, if you have comments, please include them here in the chat. They would be very happy to answer them, I'm sure. Okay, so Gabi.
So first of all, I must say that is an honor for me to have the opportunity to interview a professional like you two, because I really love this area. I'm a bit nervous because I pretend to work translate after my graduation. And I would like to thank my professor, Elton, to make today possible, and thanks Jana and Shay. Sorry, I'm very nervous to accept the invite. And my first question is for Jana. I really searched for about your life for make today. And I want to know what is like for you change the careers when you decide to leave the engineer and make translation your main job.
Hello, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy I love to talk about translation and literature, so I'm happy to be here. And yes, I graduated in food engineering, so I'm a food engineer, and I've worked for 6 years in the industry. I worked in a big company as an engineer, but I always had a relationship with literature since I was, really young. But I started writing and taking courses and studying writing after I graduated, and then I always had this relationship with literature. So I, despite being an engineer for 6 years, I started my projects, like my podcasts, Critificção, my literary magazine, Mafagafo, while I was working as an engineer. And what happened is that I started to spend a lot of time with literature, and I realized that I wouldn't be able to keep doing both things very well, because I had like a full-time job as an engineer, and then at night and during the weekends, I would work with all the literature-related stuff. And then I started to research things that I could do to work with literature, because we know that just writing, you can't make money to make a living. So I started to study things. And then I started to study translation in the Unicamp, the university where I graduated as a food engineer. And I realized that it was exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to do that. I loved all the exercises, and I started to, okay, I think this might be a good option to work with literature and pay my bills and everything and have some time to write. And then I kind of slowly did this change. So I started to save money. I talked to my bosses at the time, and I told him, look, I'm planning to take a sabbatical year in 1.5 year from now. And he was like, I think that you're not coming back. So, but okay, if you want to call that like a sabbatical year, go ahead. And then he was right. I left the company and I started to work with translation and keep doing my projects as an editor and as a writer. And then this was I feel that it was a smooth translation because a smooth transition because I already had this relationship with literature. But yes, I'm very happy, and for sure it's the I did the right thing, and I'm very happy to have swapped from engineering to choose translation.
If you're happy, I'm happy too. Thanks to answer. So I will pass the word, Andre, I think.
Hello. Actually, that's Jonathan now. I would like to talk to you later. I think it's Jonathan now, right? Jonathan, please.
Good morning, guys. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Jana, Shelly. We are so glad to have you here. And thank you, Professor Elton, for providing us this opportunity. So my question is to Jana. Okay, Jana, you have recently translated Native Tongue by Suzette Hayden Elgin. I haven't read yet, but as far as I researched it, it's a feminist science fiction book about a world where women are linguistic, and also they created a language to express their views and so on. So I would like to ask you, how was the process of translating this book, considering that the author, in fact, created a new language, an artificial language?
Yes. Oh, it was amazing when they pitched me the when Aleph told me that I would be translating. I mean, they offered me the translation. I was like, yes, please. This is amazing. I didn't know at the time the book, and that's exactly what you said. It's like a word. It looks like in terms of universe, it looks like the Handmaid's Tale. So it's a world where women are oppressed, like more oppressed, very clearly oppressed, and there is a part of of people that are linguistics. They call like lingo, and they are very important because they can communicate with alien species, and so they enable business with other planets and things like that. And so, yes, there is an artificial language in the book, but the interesting thing is that it's not a language that needed to be translated, such as in Clockwork Orange, that there is a language that you need to translate. So Fabio Fernandes did a translation of the language. So it wasn't something hard to do in terms of translation, but the author was a linguistic, so she did like many explanations about how language work and how you acquire language. The book is mostly about acquiring new languages, and that was like really it was a challenge, to talk about something that I love, a topic that I love, but I'm not a linguistic. So I was like, okay, I need to do that like very well. I need to be very careful to do this translation in a very careful way. And also the book has a lot of like, it uses the language in a very smart way also to show the oppression. So there are some words that usually when we are translating in now, we sometimes try to use like more inclusive language, but in the book the language was used as a tool of oppression. So I kind of needed to take care of not trying to alleviate those things and use words that I would use in a translation that is not based on this oppression. So the experience was amazing. That was a challenge, but yes, I love it. It's one of my favorite translations in my career so far.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Jana. I'd like to talk to welcome Shelly Boyle. Welcome, Shelly.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you for coming. Such an honor for me, it's an honor for us. It's such an honor for the Curso of Letras here at Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul. We are so happy, so glad to have you here with us this morning. Um, well, I read some poetry you translated. I searched for your job, for your work, and it's such a beautiful work. I'd like to, first of all, um, correct, give you some congratulations for your work. Yeah, I'm very interested in translation too, and I really love what I saw, what you wrote. So thank you for coming. Such an honor. I saw you. I saw an interview you gave to UFF, Universidade Federal Fluminense. You made connection between translation, the history of Tibet, and with all the political and the political intercourses and the influences of religion in the process, the history of translation
Mhm.
in Tibet. And it was such a interesting story. And well, I'd like you to share with us. Would you do that, please? Talk about a little bit the history of translation in Tibet.
Okay. First of all, good morning, everyone. Bom dia. I'd like to thank you, my friend Elton, Professor Elton, for inviting me. It's such an honor to be on this panel in this conversation with Jana and Gabriela, Jonathan, and Andre. Thank you so much. Andre, also thank you so much for doing this bit of research on my work that I have done so far and for this very interesting, intelligent question. Um, Translation, as we know, it's a very important tool to bridge, to build bridges between two cultures. And since you ask about Tibetan culture, Tibetan literature, and the history of translation in Tibet, it's a very long history. Um, what we know as Tibetan civilization today, Tibet, that country on the Himalayan plateau, what we know as Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture, Tibetan civilization today, it dates back to prehistoric times, but the prehistoric civilization is almost lost because it was not documented. Somehow the history began to be documented from the time when translation began in Tibet, which was in the 7th century AD. The Tibetan king, he sent the then Tibetan king, who was the 37th Tibetan king, he sent his minister Tony Sambhota to India to study Buddhism because one of his wives, in fact, two of his wives were Buddhist. One was Chinese Buddhist, another wife was a Nepalese Buddhist. So he really got interested in Buddhism and he sent his minister to study Buddhism in India. So his minister went to India with a team of scholars to study Buddhism. And when they studied Buddhism, they realized that they had to study the language because all of it was written in Sanskrit, you know. And then to introduce Buddhism in Tibet, they needed a language. Of course, Tibet had its own language. It was called Zangzung, but they felt it was not sophisticated enough to translate the very beautiful metaphysical postulates of Buddhism in Tibet. So when Tony Sambhota came back to Tibet, he came back with a script, which was the Gupta script of India at that time. And then he used this Gupta script and he fused it with the then prevalent script, which was Zangzung script. And then he created a Tibetan script, you know. And then this Tibetan script that he created, one was for conversation, other was for writing. This script writing, and these are called Ummed and Uchen. This particular script is the script that they use to translate Indian Buddhism into Tibetan. And from thence on began the Tibetan civilization that we know today. Now these works, they became available to people in Tibet, and they had to create a class of translators they call Lotsavas, and they had to create to spread literacy in Tibet. But literacy was, of course, only limited to the monastic institutions. So it began back then in 7th century AD, and today we know that Buddhism is known all over the world. You know, the our Indian, I'm from India, I'm also from Brazil because I have been here for many, many years, and I feel that I belong to this country. So we have this Indian epic called Ramayana, which got lost in India, but we found it in Tibetan translation. The earliest translation was in Tibetan, and the original text was lost during the Mughal desecration in India, but it's available in Tibetan translation. This is amazing. So when the Dalai Lama came into exile, the Tibetans, it's very interesting. When the Dalai Lama came into exile, he was followed by 80,000 Tibetans in the next 2, 3 years, in 59, 60, and 61, all these years. These Tibetans, of course, they were escaping the bombardments in Tibet, right? They didn't have time to pack their bags to pick up their belongings, right? Because they were just escaping the Chinese bombarding them, right? At that time, the People's Liberation Army. So they could only take a handful of things. And you know what were these handful of things that they took with them? Their scripts. They made their journey more arduous, more difficult by carrying on their backs the manuscripts, because in this manuscripts was the what we call the it was a fulcrum of the civilization. That was their way. They said is all about Tibet. That's a Tibetan identity. So they lost their toes to frostbite, but they brought to India their very precious manuscripts, and then became the reverse translation from Tibetan into world languages. So yeah, translation has a long history in Tibet. I just gave you a little bit
Yeah,
idea. I hope it helps.
yeah, it's such a wonderful. I chosen to ask you this question because I'm enthusiastic of religions. I studied Buddhism for some time, and I look at this and I thought, wow, the story of Tibet, the story of translation passes through Buddhism. So thank you for sharing. Do you think this process, all this connection, translation translation has with the story of Tibet, and do you think it has somehow um, touched you to choose to study translation, to study poetry, to translate poetry, because there's such a connection between the poetry you choose to translate, your
Mhm.
the things you find, the things you look for.
Mhm.
I read some translations you've made, and for nature, yeah, and feminism, and woods, animals, something natural, something spiritual. Do you think it has touched you somehow, this story?
Of course, it has touched me because I realized the importance of translation before I came to Brazil and needed to get into the mode of translation. Like we live in survival mode when we are in a new country, a new place. We are in a survival mode because we have to survive, and to survive, what really helps is learning the host country's language. It really helps. So until we don't learn the language, we're in a survival mode, and we are always translating in our mind. We always think twice in our native language, and then we think in the language of the host country. So the story of the translation in Tibet, it has made me understand the importance of translation and how it can help sustain a civilization, how it can help people rebuild their lives. Not only the historical translation that happened in Tibet, but also the contemporary, the Tibetan exiles. Now, 4 generations in exile, how are they making sense of their identity through translation? Just that I'm not an exile here, I'm an immigrant, so I don't have those obligations or those to my Indian civilization that they have towards the Tibetan civilization to sort of uh, to protect the civilization which is under threat. I don't have that kind of a burden on me. But I realize that how translation and learning more languages can really, really help you not only survive, but survive with more dignity and survive more richly. So I translate between Hindi, English, Portuguese, right? And why I translate between these languages is for my survival. Number one, I translate from Hindi into English. I've translated a book from Hindi into English of Rati Saxena because I do not want to lose touch with my mother tongue, which is Hindi, right? So translation is one way in which I can go back to my mother tongue, and translation of poetry, especially because poetry I really enjoy, and that is why I translate from Hindi into English, and I translate between Portuguese and English because I need to learn Portuguese language, and somehow translation is very enjoyable process. It's tedious. It can be very tedious because for one word you have a range of meanings, or for one meaning you have a range of words to choose from, and you have to bring something that is as close as to the original and yet maintain the aesthetic sense. Like, you have to sometimes choose between a beautiful wife and a faithful wife, right? So you desire that the wife is beautiful as well as faithful, so you desire to have a translation which is aesthetically beautiful and also very not aesthetically beautiful but also very close to the original in meaning. So it's tedious, but it's also very enjoyable. So translating between languages has help fix Portuguese in my head, you know. So if I have something in Portuguese, I pick up a word, so I will Google search and I will put that word in many contexts. I will search, like, phrases con esta palavra, many phrases to understand the context of the word. So it's very helpful. Yes, and also one more reason I'll tell you. Like when I go to India, I encounter a lot of bias in India about Brazil. People ask me, "Oh, you don't need to wear clothes in Brazil, because what does the TV show in India? The TV will show beach, beach babes. The TV will show favela, and the TV will show football. But mostly, what TV will show is the exotic, which is women in bikinis and thongs, right?" So people get very hyper with this, and they think, "Oh, you don't need to wear clothes in Brazil." That is so ignorant, such a ignorant idea about Brazil, because Brazil is much more than that. Likewise, I've encountered many funny ideas about India and Brazil. People still think that we are land of snake charmers, and we have elephants in the street. We do have, but we don't have it like every here and there. So translation helps me talk about in India and Brazil, which is much more than the popular image of India and Brazil. So yes.
Thank you once again. Uh, yeah, I have here another question. We would ask you later, but I believe this is the proper time because you're talking about the poetry. Uh, there's a poem you have translated, "The Girls Coming Out of the Woods," and yeah, this particular poem I love so much, and we read, all of us three, and I don't know. Do you think it would be asked so much to read this poem for us, the translation version, this translated version?
So sorry, could you repeat your question?
Yes. Would you read the poem you translate for us? The girls that are coming out from the woods.
You want me to read this in poem in Portuguese?
Yes, please. Would you?
Yes,
Is
Andre.
that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very long poem, so I will look for the poem in my folder. Meanwhile, maybe
Yes.
Jana can you can ask Jana and give me some time, then I get back and read the
Yes,
poem.
of course.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question now. It's Jonathan now, right to Jana. So thank you, Shelly. Jonathan, please.
Okay. Jana, I was reading a text of yours, the one when you're talking about things we should know about translation. And there is a specific text in which you talk about gender neutral language, that you had to push yourself to write a text without specify the gender people. So I would like to know, how do you approach this kind of question when you are translating a text, a literary text?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes, I used to translate stories from. I translate mainly fiction, and I translate from English into Portuguese and from Spanish into Portuguese. When I'm translating from Spanish into Portuguese, I don't have this problem because Spanish and Portuguese are gender languages in a very similar way. So sometimes the genders are swapped, but that's not a problem. But when I translate from English into Portuguese, sometimes there's this question about like there is no way to be, I mean there is a way, but this is not the usual way that we write and we communicate, um, to refer to characters or even to the reader in a very neutral way. That like when I say the reader in English, I'm not specifying if it's a woman, a non-binary person, or a man. But I kind of started thinking a lot about it when I translated an RPG book for children, which is the Young Adventurer's Guide from D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. And the book was like the text talked directly to the reader, and it was like a guide. So, oh, you should do that, and you can do that, etc. And in English, when they use you, it's a non, non, that it doesn't specify the gender. It's a very neutral gender language. And when I started translating it, I thought about like me as a child. I'm a very nerdy person since I'm like a child. So you can see like, oh, Star Wars shirt, etc. And I would have loved to read this book when I was a child. But when I was a child, I I can't say that I suffered a lot of oppression because I liked boy things, because my parents were really cool about it. So I had like no toys like Power Ranger toys, and it wasn't a problem. I had like birthday themed like the Teenage Mutant Turtles, etc. So it's not a problem. But there was this, kind of, oh no, this is a boy thing, this is a girl thing. And RPG is a very boy related stuff, especially when you are really young. And I didn't want to, like, girls to read the book in Portuguese and feel like, oh, você está cansado, então faça isso e fique animado. I wanted girls to read the text and doesn't feel excluded in a way. So I started to think a lot about how to do that. I wanted not to use new pronouns because I thought it could be confusing. So I started to think a lot about how to neutralize our language using tools and resources that we already have, such as using gente, pessoas que fazem tal coisa. So I don't know, like leitores, leitoras, pessoas que leem. So it's pessoas que leem is a neutral gendered way to say readers. And then I started to do that. So instead of você vai ficar cansado se você fizer isso, você vai se cansar se você fizer isso. So it's a way to kind of, not use like adjectives. I had a more like, it was more harder to not use pronouns, especially vai ajudá-lo nessa jornada. I needed to use a lot of you. Isso vai ajudar você nessa jornada. So it was like challenging, but at the same time, it was very, very interesting to realize while I was translating those books, that was a series, that we have the tools. Sometimes it's not our first choice. When we are talking, when we are writing social media, we don't use to think, oh, there's a way to be very inclusive and neutral gender in this tweet or in this email that I'm saying. So it was interesting because after that I started to think a lot about it. So when I'm writing an email to many people, instead of saying oh, vocês vão ficar, I don't know, satisfeitos de participar dessa mesa, I try to do, to use some neutral gendered language. So yeah, that was a very interesting experience. It was close to the beginning of my translation career, and I think it brought a lot of interesting things to me to think along my translation career. So I like it. Thank you for this question. I really like to talk about it.
Thank you for answering. I think it's a hard thing to sorry. I think it's a hard thing to do, but also it's very important to bring these questions into translation. Okay, now I think it's Gabi, right?
Right, it's for Jana again. Jana, you talk with Jonathan about the neutral language, and I want you to talk a little bit about your creative process, because you translate books and games, and you mentioned the RPG book, and I think it's two different words, right? So what do you think about this language you are going to use? How this process?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question too. Yeah, I had like the experience of translating a couple of books and RPG books and games that had like a lot of knowledges in English. So, and many of them are like formed by English word put together. So I needed to translate that. I didn't do that like myself, but a good example would be like the translations of Lord of the Rings, the translation of Game of Thrones a series, that there's a lot of words that you need to create in your language to reflect that knowledge is in English. I had a couple of experiences, and it's a very, very fun. That it's the funniest part of translating like fantasy, science fiction. Also, I did like I translated a RPG book, which is a bestiary. So it's a 400 monsters for RPG for D&D games. So many of them, I would say maybe 200 or more of them are named like with a neologism in English. So I needed to do, a lot of like word plays and sometimes rhymes and things like that. So it was very interesting. And I mean, what I try to do is that when we talk about fantasy, I think it's a little bit easier because I already have, because I'm a fantasy reader. I love fantasy and science fiction. So I already have like this kind of what sounds like a medieval place, what sounds like a name of monster. So I can do that. Like usually I try to find different like two or three options, and then I think a little bit about them and try to put them in the text to see which fits better in that like part of the story or the RPG book or the game or whatever. And when we talk about science fiction, I think it's a little bit difficult, harder, because science fiction sometimes brings words that are related to technology. And I think that in Portuguese and many other countries, in Brazil, in many other countries, we have a characteristic that it's words that are related to technology. Sometimes they come to Brazil and they are still used like in English or in a very how to say that, like an anglicism or something like that. So when I translated native tongue, I did translate some technologies, but some of them I choose to keep in English. Just like we use, I don't know, Bluetooth, or we don't translate because it's a name, it's a proper name. But there are other options. We say download. We do say baixar. I'm going to baixar something, but we say download. We say, smartphone. We don't say telefone inteligente. We say smartphone. So when I translate science fiction, I try to project in that future what would be our relationship with that new technology, new thing brought into Portuguese. So yes, the creative process differs depending on the genre of the story, and also if it's like I don't know, a book for children, I usually translate everything. A game, for usually I do translate, because when you're talking about, I translate board games for playing in a table, and usually you're talking about people who are reading the rules aloud. So for me, I don't like to keep things in English because people are reading that aloud, and sometimes they don't know how to say a word, and it can be hard to play. Oh, that card which is called blah 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 in English, it's harder. So I try to translate, and yeah, so I try to think about the experience in general of the reader or the player.
This is very interesting. And what's your advice to people who want to follow this path? And what's the first step to start translating?
Okay, so the first thing I think is like to translate fiction by yourself, even if you don't have a client. So what people usually do is to translate like stories that are in the public domain. So you can translate, but I know it's hard because it's like not usually, always older stories. There's a different language which is not totally contemporary. So what I like to do is like sometimes if I find a short story that I like, I do contact the author and ask them if I could translate the story. And even if I don't publish it, I did publish a couple of stories in my magazine, which I translated from contemporary authors. But sometimes I just do that to exercise. So I think this is the first thing, because then you can feel how it is to translate the genre you want to read, you like to read, the authors you admire, so you can feel how it is. And a more practical advice would be to, when you feel ready, start asking translation tests for publishing houses, which is it may sound hard and may sound like, oh, they never are going to answer me, but in my experience, it's a very good way to find jobs in publishing houses and to make people know that you translate and you are willing to translate things for them. So it's very you just send an email. Sometimes I even DM the publishing houses, just say, hey, look, I'm a translation, I would like to translate for your publishing house, who I can contact to ask for a translation test. Can you give me a name and an email? And usually people say, okay, you can talk to this editor. Sometimes they are not looking for new translators. Sometimes they are taking a long time to answer you. But many times I got like good answers and, hey, you can do a test. And if you do well, I can consider you for a book that appears in the future. So this are like a more technical and a more practical advices that I usually do to give to people who are willing to translate literature and games and etc.
There's an amazing advice. I will send you an emails, okay? So I will pass, I think it's Andre.
Jonathan now.
Okay. My next question is to Shelly. Shelly, you have said in an interview that you grew up listening 3 different languages simultaneously, né? Kangri, Hindi, and English, and now I think you speak Portuguese as well, right? So I was wondering if knowing all these languages helps you in the process of translation or gives you more work to do. So what can you tell me about?
It's actually a potential and also a problem, because like in India, for instance, we don't speak one language. We in one sentence you can find 4 languages sometimes in one sentence, which sounds very odd and weird to somebody who doesn't know all the languages. Because in India, everybody speaks at least 2 languages, but mostly speak 3, 4, 5 languages, because India is a multilingual country. We have 25 official languages in India, and we have more than 700 dialects. So, so in a day-to-day life, we speak many languages, but when we are translating, then we have to be more focused. So knowing many languages kind of distracts, and the habit of speaking 5 languages one sentence, this habit is a bad habit when you are actually working as a literary translator, right? So at the same time, it's very helpful because you have the ability to actually expand the language. I really like Jana's what she said. It was so beautifully. She put everything about gender neutrality of language, about maintaining some words of the original language in the host language. Very beautifully, she put it everything that she said, and I agree to all of that. So it helps in terms of like for instance, we had this poem, this book I did organized, like this, it was organized by me. This is a Testemunho Poético dos Tibetanos no Exílio, published by University of São Paulo. So we had this poem here by a Tibetan woman poet, Sonam. And in this poem, she talks about her mother's Tibetan dress, which is traditional dress, which is called chuba or shupa, right? Chuba or shupa. So when the translator was translating that particular poem, the English poem had the Tibetan word in it, because this word is not very easily translatable, right? It's a Tibetan word. So the translator, Professor Telma, who was translating this poem, she got stuck because the word shupa is also a swear word in Portuguese, right? So it will become an anti-climax when the reader is reading and they will, oh, okay, what does it mean here, So they have to read back again, but then it sort of, would interrupt with the narrative flow, joy of reading that poem. It would sort of take the mind somewhere else before it comes back to what the poem is about. So So since I understand some of these languages, and I do know that this word can be spelled differently. So instead of retaining it as shupa, call it shuba. P becomes B, and that's permissible in because in Tibetan language. So that's a kind of a thing that helps when you know languages, when you can do this language switching in your mind. So it is helpful. Yes, I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I have watched some indie movies, and it's interesting. How do you guys mix indie and English? It's very, very good to see. Okay, thank you, thank you. Andrei.
And before Andre asks the question, I would like to ask Shelly if you have any other hints, because they asked Jana if she had any hints for starting translators, and if you have any types of like tips to give like people who want to start like getting to know more about, I don't know, Indian literature and translation.
um, First thing is that you pick up a genre that most interests you. You know, fiction, poetry, prose. You see what interests you the most, you pick that up, and what you pick up, you make sure that it is short in length, so that you don't find it laborious and you don't get irritated and you give up. So have this short little text, a short poem, a short story, a short prose piece. You pick that up, and it always helps to do a bit of contextual research on what you are translating. Context is very very important, so you do some kind of research on internet. You can see, have take books, go to the library, pick up books, and it is very helpful if you can actually be in dialogue with the writer. It's very helpful if the writer is, if you pick up a text by a writer who is who's long gone. So you get in touch with some scholar on that text, or you get in touch with some Indian who is knowledgeable in that area, because the discussion will actually get you. You have to first, get to the meaning of the text, just not the words. It's not, text is not just words, it's much more than that. You have to get into the skin of the text, the skin of the text, inside the text. You have to get to the meaning and soul of the text. Once you have that, then you will see that translating will become fairly simple for you. It will become very enjoyable for you. So I think that's the starting point. But even before that, even this starting point, there's a pre beginning, which is that you have to ask yourself, why are you translating? What is the goal of translating? Are you doing it for some to earn money? Are you doing it for the joy of it? Are you doing it for your assignment? You have to ask that. That's very very important. You have to have clarity of mind, because believe me, if you have clarity in your mind, then you can see things very. See, it's just like, I'm sorry, I would bring a bit of Buddhism here, but this is very relevant in the field of translation also. See, if you take up a glass, okay, any looking glass, and it has a lot of dust on it, then whatever image you will see in the looking glass, that image will be distorted. You will never see the real image in the glass, right? Likewise with our mind. If a mind has the dust of ignorance, right, the dust of lack of clarity, we do not know why are we doing it, the dust of directionlessness, even personal behaviors, we have sometimes bias against another culture. you know we work through a bias, and we never understand the other culture. So if when you have this kind of dust, you will never be able to see it clearly, you will never be able to do it well. So to have clarity, you need to wipe off this dust. One dust that is very important to wipe off is bias. Sometimes we translate with the bias. If you have when I work with Tibetans on Tibetan culture, on Tibetan texts, I try to understand them from the Tibetan perspective. So your mind has to have the ability to see that text from the perspective of that culture to which it belongs. That's very very important. you know so yes, that's how you begin, and then you take, practically speaking, you have these short goals and you do these, and that's how you begin. And then when you get onto the task of publishing, I think Jana already answered that question, how you go about it. Also, one thing very important: do not pick up a text thinking, oh, you will translate it and publish it without having the right to publish it, the translation right. Because sometimes you pick up, I translated a book by this very famous Indian poet Hoshang Merchant into Portuguese. I have the whole book translated, but I cannot publish it because I don't have the rights to publish it. You see? So it was only pleasure work for me. I could never materialize it into a concrete book form. So do not make that mistake. But that comes secondary, at a secondary level. At the beginning, when you're just doing it for practicing, for learning, for joy, so yeah, that's my suggestion.
Thank you, Shelly, once again, um, for sharing with us. I have a last question before you read your poem. Um, you wrote a book called Recent Hybridities, New Narratives of Exile in Tibet, right? Um, you write about the cultural production of Tibetans in exile. Uh, I couldn't not remember. I couldn't. I remembered Brazil in the late 60s and 80s. We had a situation of exile in Brazil too. So it comes to my mind to ask you this question. Uh, could you tell us a little bit about the relation of translation and politics in this context of exile? What in the exile in Tibet? What a little bit what you talk about the relation of politics and the or the Tibetans in exile and this cultural production, if you get what I mean.
There are many questions in that one question. I'm trying to unravel these now. Just to be more clear, you ask what you want to know is the politics of Tibetan identity or culture and translation. Is that what
Yeah,
your question?
the cultural production, the relation of the cultural production and the Tibetans in exile, like uh, the situation of exile and
Okay.
the cultural production. You see?
I see. I see. Vis-a-vis translation. I get it. Okay. First thing, Andre, I this book is not written by me. Written Hybrids. I am the editor of the book with a chapter in this book. So I
I
edited this book
see.
for
Sorry.
books in the US, and it has many authors. I'm the editor and one of the authors in this book. Tibetan culture production in exile. Um, a lot of it is the traditional culture production is actually only available in translation of the classical Tibetan texts in English into English and in other world languages. The contemporary culture production, it's more in English than in Tibetan language, because unfortunately the third and the fourth generation Tibetans now, they're not as fluent in Tibetan as much they are in the languages of the host countries they live in. Now, this is a matter of both. This is a matter of both pride and pity. Pity because there is a loss of your cultural identity, which is so important for the survival of a civilization which is already under threat, as I said before. It's a matter of pride because now you're able to. You don't need someone to represent you. You can represent yourself because you speak world languages, right? So you can represent yourself. You can talk about your identity yourself, then through a medium. So that's the politics, you know. Now, what has happened in the past? When Tibetans came into exile, um, their Buddhist literature began to be translated into English, right? Mainly into English, and it was taken to the Western countries. So until now, Tibet was a forbidden land because it's a landlocked country, and also for almost 50 years, Tibetans did not allow foreign intervention because they were a de facto independent country, and they felt that in mountain topism, that is like remaining isolated on the mountains, lays their ultimate security. So there was knowledge on the world events, the world wars, and everything, but not at that very widespread scale. So when Tibetans came to exile, suddenly all these Tibetans and the Buddhist scriptures, it became the access to the knowledge of the forbidden world, right? And also the world which was popularized in Western media through this film by James Hilton, Shangri-La, this novel, and then it turned into film in which we have Brad Pitt in this film. Well, I don't know. Brad Pitt is in 7 Years in Tibet. It's another actor in this film. So Tibet became a Shangri-La, Shangri-La, the ultimate land, which is where people live for hundreds of years, right? A kind of a utopian land, right? So what happened? Like suddenly, Tibet became very accessible to people in the West through Tibetan exiles and through the translation of their books. So it led to a hype about Tibetan culture, and this hype got to this point that all about Tibet, all that like everything about Tibet, Tibetan identity, culture, everything reduced to just Buddhism. Buddhism is all pervasive in Tibetan culture. I agree, right? But Tibet is not all about only Buddhism, right? It has a political history, and that political history got totally eclipsed in this process of translation of Buddhist heritage in West. So that is what happened. And now the young Tibetans are wanting to claim their own identity. So they are challenging these translations and the impact of these translations, not challenging the what we call that, not challenging the merit of translations or the authenticity, but the impact of what these translations have done to Tibetan identity. So yes, there's a huge link between Tibetan identity, Tibetan politics, and translation of Tibetan texts into world languages. I hope that answers your questions.
Perfectly, perfectly. Thank you. Um, well, we have two last questions for the group to Shelly and Jana, one for the same question for both of them. But before that, I think we'd love to hear you reading the poem you translated. Can you please do that for us?
I love performance, but in Portuguese, I do not know how well I could be. Anyways, I'll try. Okay. So this
Yeah,
poem,
well, if you feel more comfortable, you can say that in English. It's like just because
whatever you
you
say,
have translated, yeah.
whatever you say, you want me to read in English or Portuguese, whatever you say, you decide.
Okay, I'd love to read in Portuguese. Yeah, I really
Okay.
would love
Okay.
that.
All right.
Please.
Okay. The title is As Meninas Estão Saindo da Selva, escrito por Tishani Doshi. As meninas estão saindo da selva, envoltas em mantos e capuzes, carregando barras de ferro e velas, e multidão de cicatrizes colhidas nas acras de grama primatura e dos ônibus da cidade, nos templos e bares. As meninas estão saindo da selva com calcinha amordaçadas nos lábios, fazendo um tipo de ruído impossível ouvir. O mundo também está falando? Está perguntando, na verdade, o que significa dar algum descanso eterno adequado. As meninas estão saindo da selva, levantando altos as pernas quebradas, derramando segredos das coxas abertas, todas mentiras sussurradas por estranhos treinadores de natação, e tios, especialmente tios, que falaram que abrir seria leve e fácil, que puserão balas nos peitos e alimentarão seus rostos bonitos a fogo, que sugarão a lampa, que sugarão a lama limpa para fora de suas costelas e decorarão suas caixões com sarça. As meninas estão saindo da selva, limpando o terreno para espelhar suas histórias. Mesmo essas meninas encontradas nos vales e poços, aquelas esquecidas em sótãos negligenciados e enterradas no leito do rio como sedimentos em um diferente século. Rastejam seus caminhos através das cortinas da infância, o peso rosa prateado dos corpos empurrados contra a água, contra triste, emplumada mancha de lembranças. As meninas estão saindo da selva como passarinhos chegam às janelas da manhã, bicando e cantarolando até tudo que se ouve esse quebrar é o quebrar dos seus minúsculos corações contra vidro. O brilho desesperado de som batendo, desaparecendo. As meninas estão saindo da selva, estão saindo, estão saindo.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. I love to hear that. We love to hear that, I believe. Wow, this is incredible. Such an honor for us. Really is. Thanks again, Shelly. Jonathan, please, I'd like you to take the word. Cannot hear you, Jonathan. Sorry. Your microphone.
Okay, okay. So my next question is to both of you. We have seen the rise of artificial intelligence. So I want to ask you now, how do you imagine the future of translation considering scenario? Have you already think about this? I think we can start with Jana, if it's possible.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think about it like a lot. Yeah, I think it's like kind of inevitable. Artificial intelligence is used in translation for some time now, especially in technical translation, and there's tools that help translators. But I think that when you talk about poetry, when you talk about literature, I don't think there's going to be a moment soon in which you won't need at least a facilitator to, read the text and do edit and kind of like cop edit the translation in a way that make it sound natural and sound literary, etc. Because it's as Shelly said, like very well, one word can mean many things. Can mean many things. It depends on the context, and sometimes the artificial intelligence is able to realize which is the meaning. But there's many other things that are like factors in to decide for a word or not. So you don't use to sometimes in Portuguese. I feel like that we have like many words to translate a single word in English. So I prefer to use like not repeat a word if I can, if there's this alternative, even if in English the word is repeated. Of course, when it's a rhyme or when it's intentional, the repetition we should keep. So you see, sometimes it's intentional, and you can just realize that repetition is intentional because you have a kind of a background on reading, a background on literature, and sometimes it's not. So I think that we will need to adapt ourselves. I think, like in practical terms, maybe translation changes a bit. So instead of sending me the PDF to translate from scratch, publishing houses maybe in a couple of years are going to send me a pre-translated text in Portuguese, and so I will need to do a different kind of job, which is, copy edit and make this comparison with the original. I don't know exactly how it's going to be in terms of like payment of time. Maybe you take less time to translate the book. Maybe you take more time to translate the book, because I have the experience of sometimes copy editing a story, a translation. I did both. I did like I already copy edit texts translated by artificial intelligence, and I already copy edit text translated by people who which the translation wasn't that good, and sometimes it takes even more time than translating from scratch. So I think we don't know yet how it's going to work in practical terms, but I don't see the translator vanishing. There's many things that make me think about it. I don't know. I can think about like some words in Portuguese that are only used verbally. Like some how to say that, like I forgot slang, which is
Yeah.
like maybe the artificial intelligence is not going to be able to grab all these kinds of subtlety. So I don't see the translator vanishing as a professional, but I do think we're going to change the way we work and the way maybe we are going to be, I don't know yet if we're going to be more or less seen as a very important tool in the translation, because today we're very visible, as a translator. I hope that it kind of start to show how important it is to have a person doing the work, but maybe it's going to be the other way around. So I'm not sure, but I tend to be optimistic about it in terms of like, yes, it's changing, but it's we are we are going to be able to manage this modification in a very positive way. So yeah, let's see.
Okay,
I
thanks,
agree with
Shelly.
Yes, I agree with everything that Jana said. I have the same sentiments. But I wish I had the optimism that Jana has. I'm not very optimistic, except that recently I saw somebody who's has hearing disability use artificial intelligence to be able to hear his own voice, and a woman who couldn't speak use artificial intelligence also to speak. That's the kind of artificial intelligence that I like, that I support, that I say thumbs up to. But I do not like the artificial intelligence that is dwarfing us, that is making us smaller than we are, because we are much more than that. I'm not very optimistic because I'm a mother of a 11-year-old boy, and I see that, uh, you know, uh, with for example, just computers. He writes less and types more. So just imagine what the impact on fingers and that loss of touch with paper and books. Artificial intelligence is, a leap. So it will dwarf the minds. That would be a pity. Also, artificial intelligence is artificial, right? Even if tries to imitate emotion, it can never have that soul in it. It is artificial. And literature is never superficial. One thing that we all know is that literature has a soul, right? That's why it works. Yeah, so that's what I have to say. I'm not very optimistic. I wish I could be. Maybe I will be in the future. I will change my mind. But at the moment, when I see impact of these things on my son, I get worried. I really get worried.
Thank you, Shelly. Professor Elton?
Yes, thank you for giving me the word. In fact, we are approaching our time, and we have to conclude. But before we conclude, I would like to ask our guests if they have any questions to ask each other. So, if Shelly wants to ask Jana about anything, or if Jana wants to ask Shelly anything, now is your chance. You have like one question each, if you have them. If you don't, we can move to my next question.
I do think I do have a question, which is like something I don't know if it's like a very precise question, but I'm very, very impressed with poetry translation. I tried to do that. I did some poetry translation, not like for poetry books, but some excerpts in stories. And for me, it's very hard, but it's very pleasant to do. So I like, but I feel I don't know. I take a long time to to feel that it's exactly what I wanted to. Not me, but what the final version is exactly what I wanted to. And I would like to ask that what if you use some tool, not an automatic tool or anything, but I don't know. You like rely only in your knowledge of the language to look for rhymes, as an example, or you do search for words that end with a specific phoneme, and then you start to think, okay, I could have, I could make this modification here to fit this word. I don't know. For me, it's very, it's a mystery how poetry translation works, for me, and I think it's very beautiful, and I love to read poetry on translation. But yeah, I would like to hear more about this, your techniques or.
Yeah. Thank you, Jana, for that wonderful question. This question is precisely the reason why translating poetry is not as easy as it looks. It is laborious. It is laborious. First, I translate the meaning. I translate the poem as it means. Then I begin to substitute words for words which are more closer to the original. And then I begin to substitute words that are more close to the original in terms of rhyme, in terms of style, in terms of internal music. I do that. So that's my technique, and this is a process that takes time. I feel that translating fiction is much more laborious, because if translating poetry is so laborious, fiction would be much more laborious. That is my question to you. What do you think, Jenna?
Yeah, I think I never did like calculated how long I take, because poems usually that are shorter, so it's you should take like less time to translate it. But as you said, it's very laborious, and you need to do translations like 3 times. I recently did like for fun, not for work, but I watched round table, actually exposition about a versionist from Disney musicals, how she translates the musical the musics from Disney musicals into Portuguese. And I did like one music like for fun, because she gave us like a lot of what do you need to consider. And when you're talking about movies, there's some phonemes that need to be, if the character has an open mouth, that moment when they're singing like you need to make a similar phoneme and a lot of very complex things. And I tried to do that, and I felt like I would take longer, even if it's like the music is very short, take longer compared to a chapter of a book, as an example. So I think like it's, for me, it needs different parts of your brain, if it makes sense. And so I can say like, it's harder, or it's like it's more laborious to translate fiction, or poetry or music. I feel like it's very, you need to exercise very different things, and you need also to use very different how to say that, like very different backgrounds maybe. So if you are like very used to hear musicals and musics, maybe it's going to be easier for you. If you're used to read a lot of poetry in different languages, it's going to be easier or harder for you. So yeah, I feel I really, it's something that fascinates me, how different can be to translate. Even when I talk about fiction, when I translated Native Tongue, when I translated The Last Man from Mary Shelley, compared to, I don't know, some fantasy contemporary book, I feel like you're using different muscles, like translation muscles. So yeah, I think this is very interesting how it depends on many things. For me, translation is like that. Every time somebody asks about translation, the word depends comes into play, because depends on a lot of things. There's no objective answers. So yeah.
One thing I think that you got closer to saying, conveying, is that when you talk about the muscle of the translator, the mental muscle, I think the translators are also creators. I like to see translators as also creators. And when we are translating, there's also kind of artistic intervention from our own end. This is this kind of creative intervention, just that we have to balance it out, because the text should be the main author's text. The translation should belong to us, but the sense that we get out of it should belong to the author. So this kind of artistic intervention really helps when we come across these kind of situations, when there are words that are not translatable, when there are rhymes that are not maintainable. There's some rhymes that you cannot maintain. If you try to maintain, then you lose something else, which is much bigger, right? So there, what we use is to use a creative intervention to bring it best close to the original, but at the same time have it artistically conveyed. So yeah, I like to see us translators also as creators.
Yes, no, totally. I totally feel like that. And I write like you also write like original work. So I think this is very interesting. And sometimes I read some translation and I do like, this is a perfect, this is a very competent translation, but it's like it missed something, like I would like to see more of the, not the translation as a person. I would like to read it and recognize person A or person B in this translation, but I would like to feel like I'm reading something that was written in Portuguese, even though it wasn't. So I can read that. I see that it's not written originally in Portuguese, because I don't know, it's set in another country, set in another world. But I want to read the dialogues and see, oh, yes, it could be Brazilian people talking to each other. So, and sometimes it's like, oh, it's very precise, it's very correct, the translation, but it's not, I don't know, there's no, balagandã, assim, there's no, it's something that it cannot be explained,
Okay, now we can finish, or before we finish, I would like to have our Hora do Jabá. I don't know if Shelly knows this expression. Do you know, Shelly? Hora do Jabá, Jabá time. It's the moment you are going to talk about current and future projects. So I know probably you are involved in many, many projects. I know Jana is a multitasker, Shelly as well. So think about one or two. Some of them I know are secret because translators have this like secret thing, and you cannot, publicize you are working on something until you were told you can. But anyway, what are you working on right now, and in the future, what can we expect from you, Jana?
Yes, okay. So yeah, I do want to talk. I can't yet, but I have a very amazing translation to coming out like in the next months. I think it's the most challenging translation I did in my career so far. Not because it was hard or anything, but because I don't know, there's a fan base involved, and I'm very excited to I think I'm going to be able to talk about it in October already. So it's like, no, sorry, September. So it's close. But talking about not only translation, but talking about talking about translation, I would like to talk about the Discord server that I have, my project Fantástico Guia. So it's a Discord server that you can enter for free. Recently, we did like a translation club there. So every Saturday, we would talk about a short story from Eugenia, which is a Greek author who writes in English. And we translated a story which was nominated for the Nebula Award, which is very famous. And she was able to talk to us. So, as Shelly said, when they're able to talk to the author about translation, is very interesting. And we plan to do that. We intend to do that like more often. So people who translate may be interested in being in the server. I can share the link with you, Elton, after the conversation. Maybe you send to everybody. But it's the server is called Fantástico Guia. If you go to in our website is fantasticoguia.com.br, there is a link there for the Discord server. So who wants to be there can be there. And I think we may talk about translation soon.
Okay, I'll include that in the chat and in the comment, in the description of the video as well. Shelly.
Actually, right now I'm trying my level best to finish two pending books from last year. I was supposed to finish them last year in December, but I hope I can finish it this year. One of them is the poetry book by an Indian poet, Katyayani, which I translated into English, but I have to go back and edit the English version of the poems from Hindi into English. And the second project is it's again a book of poetry by women writers from my home state in India, from the mountains. It's called The Black Magic of Women from the Mountains, because there's a notion in India, not a very widespread notion, but yes, there's a notion that women from the hills, they are very clever, they know black magic and these kind of funny notions. So especially they would do black magic on men, to sort of bewitch them. So it's very irritating thing, in this 21st century we have people thinking like that. So with a colleague of mine in India, Kamayani, we thought of doing this book and talking about the women writers, the women poets from Himachal, my home state in India. And these poems are, some of them are written in English, but most of them are translations from Hindi into English. And I'm also looking into poems written in native languages, not just Hindi but other languages, the dialects. Sometimes they don't have a language, but they write in Hindi. They write it using the Hindi script, but the language is it's a dialect. It's what they speak, the spoken language. So yes, that's what I'm doing, and I hope to finish these two this year. And then next year I have some more projects, which I think I better not talk about. First, I have to do what I can. Then first I have to do what is necessary. Then I can do what's possible. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presence here. it's always like so interesting. People were commenting on the chat that it's beautiful, that it's like that they were so happy with your presence here and with the things we were talking about. It was a nice conversation, I think. I hope you agree. Last year, I forgot to tell you that this project started last year. We had Pete Risati and Marina Della Valle. I think you know them. And I mean, next year we want to we intend to bring again other translators, and translation is something we are going to be talking about always that we have an opportunity. So thank you so much for being here with us. And I mean, I wish you like all the best in your projects and your endeavors. Okay. Um, all right. So next week we are going to have our next conversation for literary talks. It's going to be with Nigerian writer Chinelo Onwalu, and she's going to be here talking to us about fantastic fiction and her work, her life. And so I invite you to be here with us in this next literary talks meeting. Okay, so bye bye. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you,
Bye
everyone.
bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you
To
very
everybody.
Thank you
much.
It's
all.
beautiful. Thank
Ciao,
you so
ciao.
much, Jana. Bye. Bye bye.
Ciao.